Abbie's Journey, 1857.
It was a horrible winter, but the calendar was suggesting spring was on its way. The Gardners had just moved into a Dickinson County cabin Roland and Frances Gardner had built beside the lake native people called Okoboji, a place of rest. Along with a string of other pioneer families on the lakeshore, the Gardners tried to survive that winter. The closest settlement was Fort Dodge, a long trek east. On March 8, 1857, in a log cabin in the cold, the Gardner family was visited by a band of Wapakudi Santee, who, with other native bands, had been forced off their homelands by Euro-American settlements into supposed neutral land in northwest Iowa, between the Little Sioux and Big Sioux rivers. The Wapakudis were led by Ink Paduta, a headman who nursed grievances he'd carried from the time his brother and family were murdered by a white man who was never punished for his crimes. Death broke into the cabin that late winter morning. Abbie Gardner's father and mother, her brother Rowley, her sister Mary, as well as Mary's baby girl and young son were all slaughtered mercilessly before Abbie's eyes by Ink Paduta's band. I was dragged from the never-to-be-forgotten scene, Abbie wrote years later in a memoir. No language can ever suggest, much less portray, my feelings. She was herself taken captive, along with 3 other women abducted in subsequent attacks. After 3 long months of horrifying captivity, after the murders of 2 other captive women, Mrs. Noble, as well as Abbie's friend Mrs. Thatcher, 2 Yankton rescuers purchased her freedom. She was 13 years old. By her own confession, her healing required a lifetime. Eventually, she returned to the lakes area, ironically to the cabin where she suffered so much horror. She wrote a memoir about her life's sadness, even sold copies at the old family cabin. Ink Paduta went on to live his life as a blanket native, pushing back against Euro-American settlements invading the region and looking over his shoulder to avoid capture. He was never imprisoned or lived on a reservation, and lived out his years protected by native people who honored him. He died in Canada. When Abbie Gardner in later years visited the Santees at Flandreau, South Dakota, she experienced the kind of reconciliation we all dream of when she stood in community with newfound Santee friends at a place so close to the Big Sioux River that she claimed she could see the place where her friend Mrs. Thatcher had been brutally murdered 35 years earlier. The past and present scenes rose up and passed before me like a living, moving panorama, she wrote in her memoir. It was, she said, truly marvelous, her day of realization. Amazing as it seems, that reconciliation is yet today in the epigraph on her cemetery stone at the cabin. Orphaned and enslaved by hostile Sioux, she lived to embrace in Christian benevolence the American Indian and all mankind.